A major review of Tasmania's finances warns the state budget is unsustainable and heading for a basket case fiscal crisis. The report by independent economist Saul Eslake, forced on Tasmania's Liberal minority government by the Jacqui Lambie network, says the government is to blame for the state's fiscal deterioration and that major taxation reforms are needed to save the state. Saul Eslake is an independent economist and the Vice-Chancellor's Fellow at the University of Tasmania, and he joins me now. Saul, good to chat.
Good morning, Steve. Thank you for having me on the program.
Our pleasure. Your report describes Tasmania's financial situation as heading towards a basket case scenario. What are the key factors that have led to this fiscal crisis?
Well, I didn't use that term in the report, and I think it was a headline.
Okay.
But certainly Tasmania is headed towards a situation that I would regard as unsustainable in the absence of corrective action. This shouldn't really come as a surprise because on 3 separate occasions since 2016, Tasmania's own Treasury has warned of the unsustainable trajectory on which Tasmania's fiscal settings were directed and had urged with increasing shrillness corrective action, emphasising that if it were taken sooner, it would be easier than putting it off until the never. But Tasmania has, since 2017-18, gone from having budget balances or small surpluses to having large deficits. It's gone from being a net creditor, that is, having more cash in the bank that it owed, to becoming a significant net debtor, on top of having Australia's largest unfunded superannuation liability to present and former public sector employees than any other state or territory. And more recently, it's embarked on the largest public sector infrastructure spending program as a percentage of its economy of any state or territory. And on top of that, at 3 successive elections, the government has committed to spend $1.4 billion or more over the following 4-year periods without saying barely a word as to how those promises would be paid for. So publicly available information shows that the deterioration in Tasmania's financial position since the late 2010s has been entirely the result of policy decisions taken by the government of the day rather than unforeseen adverse economic developments or changes in the amount of money coming from Canberra, on which Tasmania depends to a greater degree than any other state except the Northern Territory.
So that is quite a diagnosis of the problem. What is the solution?
Well, when a government finds itself in this position, it, broadly speaking, has 3 options. It can cut spending, it can raise additional revenues, or it can sell assets. I argue that there's limited scope for cutting spending in Tasmania's context because analyses by the Grants Commission that are part of how it works out how much each state and territory should get from the GST revenues, and Tasmania traditionally does pretty well out of that process. The Grants Commission figures suggest that Tasmania is already spending an average of about $530 million a year, or 8% less than it would need to provide Tasmanians with the same public services as the average of all other states and territories. By contrast, the same analysis shows that the Tasmanian government raises about $170 million a year less from state taxes than it would if its state tax regime were similar to that of the average of all states and territories, and about $40 million a year less from mineral royalties than it would if the royalty regime was the same as other states and territories. Now, in the Tasmanian context, they're fairly large numbers. It suggests there's not a lot of scope for cutting spending, and I argue that trying to cut spending by vacancy control and efficiency dividends is a pretty ineffectual and lazy way of seeking to cut expenditures. But there is scope for Tasmania to raise more revenue from its own resources, which not only would help fix the budgetary problem, but would also help to make Tasmania more resilient to things beyond its control, such as the corruption of the GST revenue sharing system at the behest of Western Australia that was initiated by the Morrison government and continued by the Albanese government at a cost to the federal budget of $53 billion over 11 years. And Tasmania is always vulnerable to decisions like that, and raising more revenue from its own sources would help to reduce the risks that Tasmania faces from that source. I considered the argument for selling assets, and Tasmania's GBE sector is proportionately larger than that of any other state, with the possible exceptions of Queensland and Western Australia. But among the arguments for not doing that are that with interest rates being much lower than they were when other state governments sold energy businesses, in particular in the 90s and early 2000s, the savings from using the proceeds for repaying debt would be less, whilst Tasmania's GBEs make very significant financial contributions through income tax equivalent payments and dividend payments to the state budget, which are, I think, sufficiently high that the financial arguments for privatisation that have worked for governments in the past wouldn't stand up in the current context in Tasmania.
Okay.
So there's probably not much point in doing that either.
On Radio National Breakfast, we're talking to Saul Eslake, independent economist. Saul, while I've got you here, I really want to ask you about housing policy on a federal scale. This is something that you've been very interested in over the years. You've been giving your views on what government should be doing to fixing the housing market. What is your assessment of what the Albanese government is trying to do to tackle the crisis?
Well, they're getting part of it absolutely right. I fully support the efforts that the current government is making to boost housing supply, including by spending more money on building housing, grants to the states and the like, and through the fund that they have established off budget. That will make a meaningful contribution over time to boosting the supply of housing, as long as we can find sufficient tradespeople and building materials to construct housing in accordance with the government's fairly ambitious timetable. And we're falling behind on that in the period immediately ahead, but that's an important thing for governments to be doing. I've also, however, long argued that governments at all levels, federal and state, need to back away from policies that needlessly inflate demand, and those policies include first homeowner grants, stamp duty concessions, mortgage guarantee schemes, and very generous by international standards tax treatment for investment in property, particularly established property. One of the things that I think is particularly unfortunate is to see that Kamala Harris, who seems now to have a better chance of becoming the next US president than Joe Biden would have done, has copied one of the worst Australian policies. That is, she's promising to give US first home buyers a $25,000 first home owner grant. You only need to look at Australia's experience since the first one of those was introduced in this country in 1964 to know that those things should be called second home vendor grants, because that's where the money ends up. All they do is inflate the price of housing. Yeah. Absolutely. So we need to stop doing those sorts of things. The federal government could lean more heavily on the states to in turn lean more heavily on their local governments to relax zoning and planning laws that make it difficult to build more housing, especially higher density housing, in the places where people want to live, closer to places of employment, entertainment, recreation and the like. There's more work that could be done there that would also help to boost housing supply. And state and local governments could further help by reducing the, in many cases, quite heavy taxes that they impose on the construction of new housing, which either deters new housing from being built or inflates its price to the detriment of those who want to buy it.
Saul, we'll have to leave it there, but thanks for your views this morning.
That's a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Saul Eslake, independent economist and the Vice-Chancellor's Fellow at the University of Tasmania.